Clara Whitfield did not cry when her uncle's fist caught the side of her jaw. She had learned long ago that crying only made men like Silas hit harder. So she fell into the summer dust without a sound, her lips split. Her dress torn at the shoulder, the copper taste of blood already thick on her tongue. The whole town of Red Bluff watched. Not a single soul moved. That was the moment Ethan Calloway wrote in. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow Clara's journey to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 came to Red Bluff, Arizona territory like a punishment nobody had earned and nobody could escape. The sky turned the color of bleached bone by 8 in the morning. The earth cracked in long, ugly lines. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed had gone gray at their edges, their leaves curling inward like fists. Water cost more than flour that season. Cattle were dying on open range. And people, ordinary frightened, struggling people, were turning mean in the way that only real desperation can make a person mean. Clara Whitfield had lived inside that meanness for 6 years. She was 22 years old, though she moved through the world with a careful stillness that made most people guess older. Her eyes were gray, the kind of gray that holds light without giving it back. Her hands were rough and capable. Her posture, even in rags, even covered in cooking grease and supply dust, stayed straight, not out of pride exactly, but out of practice. She had taught herself to stand tall, because she had learned young that a woman who curls herself small invites people to step on her. It hadn't worked in the end, but she kept standing anyway. The trading post that bore the name Whitfield and Sons in chipped yellow paint above the door had been her prison for 6 years, ever since her mother Ruth had died of a fever in the spring of 1872. Clara had been 16 years old alone, and her only living relative was her mother's brother Silas. He had arrived at the graveside already calculating. He had taken her in with the language of charity and the intentions of a man who had found something useful for free. 6 years later, Clara had cooked every meal in that building, washed every shirt swept, every floor, kept every account book written, every supply order in her careful, even hand, and managed every customer who came through the door needing fair treatment when Silas was drunk in the back room, which was most afternoons and all of Saturday. In return, she had received a cot near the kitchen stove, 2 dresses her meals when Silas remembered to leave food, and the daily reminder that she was a burden, a mistake, a charity case who ought to be grateful for the roof above her worthless head. She had not been paid a single dollar, not once in 6 years. On the afternoon that everything changed, it was a Thursday in late July. The heat was catastrophic. Clara had been in the supply room since before dawn, taking inventory of the incoming freight that had arrived by wagon the previous evening. She counted bolts of cotton cloth sacks of cornmeal and salt tins of lard dried beans, a crate of canned peaches, 2 boxes of ammunition, and 1 small shipment of ladies' combs and hair ribbon that Silas had ordered without asking her and would now expect her to sell by charm alone. She recorded every item in the ledger in her precise handwriting. She noted what had arrived, what was missing from the order, and what the supplier had apparently substituted without authorization. She cross-referenced the invoice against the order form. She found a discrepancy of $4.60. She set the ledger on the counter and went to find Silas. He was in the back room with 2 men Clara had never liked. A railroad surveyor named Dobbs, who smelled of tobacco and bad intentions, and a land speculator from Tucson, whose name she had never been told, but who looked at her the way men look at furniture they are considering purchasing. "There's a discrepancy in the freight invoice," she said from the doorway. $4.60. The supplier shorted us on the cornmeal and didn't note it. Silas looked up from his whiskey. His face had gone the deep, blotchy red that meant he had been drinking since noon. His eyes held that particular meanness, the meanness that was looking for a place to land. "Who asked you?" he said. "Nobody asked me. But if we don't dispute the invoice before the wagon company's courier leaves town tomorrow morning, we lose the money. That's your money, Silas. I'm only—" "I said?" Silas repeated louder. "Who asked you?" Dobbs laughed. The Tucson man studied his fingernails. Clara stood in the doorway for one more moment. She was deciding whether this was the fight worth having. It usually wasn't. Most days she absorbed the cruelty. The way dry ground absorbs rain, took it in, let it disappear, kept moving. But today she was tired. The kind of tired that goes past the body. "The freight ledger is on the counter," she said. "If you want to dispute the invoice, it needs to happen before." "Get out," Silas said. She went. She walked back through the supply room, picked up the ledger, and began shelving the new stock. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was set. She shelved cornmeal and lard and ammunition and the ridiculous hair ribbon, and she told herself, as she had told herself 1,000 times before, that she would find a way out. That she was saving toward it. That she had $12 hidden in the lining of her second dress, and that $12 was not enough, but it was more than zero, and more than she'd had a year ago. She was shelving the canned peaches when Silas came through the door. She heard him before she saw him. Heard the particular heavy, unsteady quality of his boots. The sound of a man propelled not by purpose, but by the need to do damage somewhere. "You went through the safe," he said. Clara set down the can of peaches slowly. "I did not touch the safe. $4.60 missing." His voice was climbing. "You've been stealing from me, Silas." She turned to face him. She kept her voice flat and even because she knew from long experience that panic only accelerated things. "The $4.60 is a freight discrepancy. I noted it in the ledger. I was trying to tell you about it so you could, liar." He said it the way a man might say dog without heat, without particular feeling, just a label applied to something beneath consideration. "Your mother was a liar, and you're a liar." Something moved behind Clara's breastbone. She pressed it flat. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" He stepped toward her. The supply room was narrow, and there were boxes stacked along both walls, and the only way out was through him or through the back window, and she had calculated that distance 100 times over 6 years. "Don't tell the truth about a thieving girl who costs me more than she's worth. I have never stolen from you." Each word was separate and careful. "I have worked in this building for 6 years without pay, and I have not once." The back of his hand caught her face before she finished the sentence. The blow knocked her sideways into a shelf of dry goods. Tins clattered. A bag of flour split. White dust filled the air between them. Clara caught herself on the shelf's edge, one hand braced against the wood. Her left ear was ringing. Her lip had split against her back teeth. She could taste the copper brightness of blood already. She did not make a sound. She straightened, picked up the ledger that had fallen with her, held it against her chest. "Get out of my building," Silas said. "You're done here." She walked out the back and around the building and into the main street of Red Bluff, and the sun was so violent after the dimness of the supply room that she had to stop and let her eyes adjust. The street was busy mid-afternoon, a dozen people conducting the ordinary business of a Thursday, women with market baskets, men discussing cattle prices, children underfoot, 2 wagons being loaded in front of the grain warehouse. Every single person on that street saw her come around the corner. They saw the flour dust in her hair, the blood on her mouth, the torn shoulder of her dress where she'd struck the shelf. Not one person moved. Clara walked to the center of the street, because that was the direction she had been going, and she did not know yet where else to go. Her legs were steady. Her back was straight. The blood from her lip was dripping onto the bodice of her dress, and she pressed the ledger harder against her chest, as if the ledger were something worth protecting, which she supposed it was. It was evidence, after all, of the discrepancy she had tried to report, of the work she had done, of the careful, precise accounting that Silas had decided to call theft. She heard the door of the trading post bang open behind her. Silas came into the street. He had an audience now, and an audience always made him worse. "There she is," he announced to the street of watching faces. "Clara Whitfield, thieving girl, lived off my charity for 6 years and stole from me for the last time." He was walking toward her. Her mama was the same way, ungrateful, worthless, no better than a... That's enough. The voice was not loud. It was not. It was simply a voice that landed with such complete authority that it stopped Silas Whitfield mid-sentence and turned every head on the street toward the rider who had just come in from the north end of town. Clara turned too. The man sat his horse with the particular easy economy of someone who had been in the saddle most of his adult life. He was perhaps 35 or 36, lean and sun-darkened with dark eyes that were currently reading the street with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who was making calculations, and had nearly finished making them. He wore a dark brown vest over a light shirt with the sleeves rolled at the forearms, a dark hat, a holstered revolver he had not reached for, dust on his boots that said he had been riding a long time. He did not look angry. That was the thing that made people step back. He looked decided. He swung down from the horse in one smooth motion, dropped the reins over the post outside the grain warehouse without looking, and walked toward Silas Whitfield with his hands loose at his sides. "Hit her again," he said, "and you answer to me." Silas blinked. He outweighed the stranger by 30 pounds, and he had 2 men at his back. Dobbs and the Tucson speculator had followed him into the street. He drew himself up with the false courage of a man who has always had an audience to protect him. "This is none of your affair," Silas said. "This woman is my kin, and she's a thief, and I'll handle her however I—" "No," the man said. "Just the one word, flat as a stone. You don't know her." Silas tried again, voice rising. "You don't know what she's done. She's been stealing from me for—" "I know what I saw," the man said. "I know what this whole street saw." He let his gaze move briefly across the watching faces, and Clara saw something interesting happen. Several people looked away. A few looked ashamed. One woman with a market basket dropped her eyes to the ground. "My name is Ethan Calloway," the man said, and a low murmur moved through the crowd in a way that Clara didn't understand yet. "And I'm asking this young woman if she needs assistance." He turned to Clara then. He looked at her directly, not with pity, not with the particular bright male concern that she had learned to distrust, because it always came wrapped around an expectation, but with a simple level attentiveness, as if her answer genuinely mattered, and he was prepared to wait for it. "Ma'am," he said, "are you all right?" Clara became aware that she was still holding the ledger against her chest. She became aware of the blood drying on her lip, of the flour dust in her hair, of the 30-some-odd people watching her from the safety of their uninvolvement. She was not all right. She had not been all right for 6 years, but she was standing. "I'm standing," she said. Something moved across Ethan Calloway's face. It was not quite a smile. It was something quieter and more serious than a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You are." He turned back to Silas. "She's leaving now," he said. "You're going to let her." "She's got nowhere to go," Silas said, and his voice had acquired a new quality, not quite uncertain, but reaching for something to stand on. "She's got nothing, nobody. She'll be back by nightfall begging—" "She won't be," Ethan said. He said it with the same flat certainty he said everything, and Clara noticed that Silas did not take another step forward. "And you're going to stay on your side of this street." Dobbs put his hand on Silas's shoulder and said something low and urgent in his ear. Whatever it was, it worked. Silas stopped advancing. His face had gone a darker red. His hands were fists, but he stayed where he was. Ethan turned back to Clara. "I'm riding out to my ranch in about 20 minutes, he said. "I could use someone who can keep supply ledgers. The work is honest, and the pay is fair." He paused. "If that's of no interest to you, I understand, and I'll make sure you get safe to wherever you're headed. Either way, you're not staying here." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had learned not to trust offers. She had learned that kindness from strangers was usually a prelude to a cost she couldn't afford. She had learned to calculate what people wanted before she let them close enough to take it. She looked at Ethan Calloway's hands. They were still loose at his sides. He hadn't moved toward her. He was standing at a careful distance, giving her room that she hadn't known until this moment she had been desperate for. "You said fair pay," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What does that mean specifically?" Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of respect. $1.50 a week plus room and board, same as I pay my head cook. Clara did the math in her head in 3 seconds flat. That's more than your head cook should be accepting, she said. Going rate for experienced household management and bookkeeping is closer to $2 a week in this territory. Ethan Calloway looked at her for a moment. $2 a week, he said, plus room and board. And I keep my own accounts, Clara said. And my own time on Sundays. Done, he said. Clara exhaled through her nose. She looked back at the trading post at Silas, standing in the street with his whiskey-flushed face and his fury that was already curdling into something smaller, into the sulk of a man who knows he has lost the audience. She looked at the closed faces of the people on the street who had watched her fall and watched her bleed and had not moved. She looked down at the ledger in her hands. The ledger that contained, she suddenly remembered certain entries from 2 years ago that she had never fully understood, entries in Silas's handwriting that had never matched any freight invoice she'd been given. Figures that had never appeared in the official accounts, amounts that were consistent in size and irregular in timing. She tucked the ledger under her arm. I'll need 5 minutes to collect my things, she said. Take 10, Ethan Calloway said. She walked back past Silas without looking at him. She walked through the supply room, past the split flour bag and the scattered tins, and into the small back room where her cot stood in the corner. She took her second dress, rolled it around the $12 in the lining. She took her mother's small Bible, the one thing of Ruth Whitfield's that Silas had never bothered to notice. She took her good pen and the ink bottle and her personal record book, the one she'd kept in secret for 3 years, logging every hour of work and every item she'd handled and every dollar she'd saved. She looked at the cot, at the stove, at the window above the cot where she had watched 6 years of Red Bluff mornings arrive without her permission. She picked up her bundle. She walked out the front door of Whitfield & Sons Trading Post for the last time. Ethan Calloway was waiting where he said he'd be, holding his horse's reins and talking to nobody, looking at nothing in particular, giving her the dignity of an exit that didn't require an audience. The street had mostly cleared. Silas was gone. Dobbs and the Tucson man were gone. There were 2 women by the dry goods store who watched Clara come out with expressions she couldn't quite read, not unkind exactly. More like the expression of people watching something happen that they wished they had been part of earlier. Clara walked to where Ethan Calloway stood. I should tell you, she said, that I don't know you. I don't know your ranch or your people or whether your word means what it sounds like it means. That's fair, he said. I'm coming because I have $12 and a cot that belongs to a man who just told me to leave, she said. Not because I trust you. Also fair, he said. But I'll keep the accounts honestly, she said. Whatever else the accounts will be honest. That's what I do. Ethan Calloway looked at her. Really looked at her the way very few people had looked at Clara Whitfield in 6 years. As if she were a complete person. As if what she'd just said mattered, and he was actually considering it. I reckon honest accounts are exactly what I need, he said. He offered to help her up onto the spare horse he had on a lead line. She mounted without assistance, the ledger tucked firmly under one arm and her small bundle strapped behind the saddle with practiced efficiency. They rode north out of Red Bluff in the full blaze of the afternoon sun, and Clara did not look back. She was thinking about those ledger entries. The irregular figures in Silas's handwriting. The amounts that never matched any invoice she'd seen. She was thinking that $12 was not enough. That $2 a week plus room and board was a better start. That she was 22 years old and had been kept in a room above a trading post stove for 6 years and had never stopped keeping records. She pressed her hand against the ledger under her arm. There was something in these numbers. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she was going to find out. The road north toward Calloway Ranch unrolled ahead of them through the cracked summer earth, and the sky was enormous and pale above, and the heat pressed down on Clara Whitfield's shoulders like something that had been there a long time, familiar, heavy, and for the first time in 6 years, possibly temporary. She straightened her back. She rode. The road to Calloway Ranch was 14 miles of hard-packed earth that offered no shade and no conversation, and Clara was grateful for both. She did not try to fill the silence. Neither did Ethan Calloway. He rode slightly ahead enough to lead, but not enough to ignore her, and he checked back on her twice in the first hour, not hovering, not fussing, just the brief assessing glance of a man who had taken on a responsibility and intended to keep it. Both times, she met his eyes steadily, and both times he looked forward again without comment. She appreciated that too. She had spent 6 years in a building full of noise. Silas's voice, the clatter of the trading post, the opinions of customers, the endless low-grade static of a man who required an audience even when he was alone. Silence was not something she was accustomed to being offered. She held the ledger across her knees the entire ride. Her hands kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not seeking comfort exactly. Seeking the thing that needs attending. By the time the roof of the main house came into view, the sun had dropped enough to turn the sky copper and rust at the edges, and Clara's back ached from the ride, and her lip had stiffened where it had split, and she realized, extraordinarily hungry. She had not eaten since the piece of cornbread she'd had before dawn. She did not mention any of this. Ethan Calloway's ranch was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. It was a working ranch that was the first and most important thing. Not a showplace. Not the kind of spread that existed to impress visitors. The fences were repaired where they needed to be repaired and left plain where they didn't need impressing. The barn was large and practical. There were 6 ranch hands visible from the yard as they rode in, and every one of them looked up, assessed, and went back to work with the efficiency of men who had things to finish before dark. One man did not go back to work. He was perhaps 50 with a grizzled beard and the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades reading weather, and he walked toward them with a rolling gait that suggested an old injury to his right hip that had healed badly and been ignored. "Boss," he said, nodding at Ethan. Then he looked at Clara, at the dried blood on her lip, the flour dust in her hair, the ledger on her knees, and something moved through his weathered face that was neither pity nor intrusion. It was simply acknowledgement. "Ma'am." "This is Walt Briggs," Ethan said. "My foreman. Walt, this is Miss Clara Whitfield. She'll be handling household management and the supply ledgers." Walt looked at Clara for one more moment. "You eat yet today?" he asked. It was such a direct and practical question that Clara felt something loosen unexpectedly in her chest. "No," she said. "I'll have someone put something together," Walt said, and that was that. No performance of sympathy. No commentary on her condition. Just the recognition of a need and the immediate intention to address it. She decided she liked Walt Briggs. Ethan helped her down from the horse, offered his hand. Didn't take over when she was managing, let go the moment she was steady. A small thing. She noticed it. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said. "Then we can talk about the work whenever you're ready. Tonight or tomorrow morning, whichever you prefer." "Tonight," Clara said immediately. He looked at her. "You just rode 14 miles on a borrowed horse after—" "Tonight," she said again. He nodded once. "Tonight then." The room she was given was small and plain and clean, and it had a window that faced east, and there was a proper bed with a real mattress and a washstand, with a ceramic basin and a door that locked from the inside. Clara stood in the middle of it for a moment after Ethan left and looked at the door with the lock on it, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like she could breathe. She washed her face, changed her dress, examined her lip in the small mirror above the washstand, swollen, but the split was clean and would heal. She unpacked her bundle with the efficiency of someone who had learned to keep possessions minimal and organized. Mother's Bible on the windowsill, ink and pen on the small desk, her personal record book beside them, the ledger she set in the center of the desk. She was going to come back to those entries. Supper was plain food served in the kitchen by a stout woman named Dora, who ran the ranch kitchen with the cheerful authority of someone who knows her domain is the most important room in any building. Dora set a plate in front of Clara without ceremony, beans, salt pork cornbread, a cup of strong coffee, and said, "Eat it while it's hot. I don't reheat." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said and meant it. She was halfway through the plate when Ethan came in and poured himself coffee and sat across from her without asking, which she found she didn't mind. "Tell me about the ledger work that needs doing," she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You just got here. You said you needed someone who can keep supply ledgers. I'd like to understand the scope." He was quiet for a moment. "Current cook manages the household accounts, but the supply records are a mess. 3 different hands have kept them over the past 2 years, none of them with any system, and I can't get a clear picture of what's coming in or going out." "How long has the discrepancy been running?" He paused at the word discrepancy. "What discrepancy?" "There's always a discrepancy when 3 different people keep records with no system. The question is whether it's an arithmetic problem or a judgment problem." She took a sip of coffee. "Arithmetic problems are easy. Judgment problems depend on whether anyone was dishonest or only careless." Ethan set down his cup. He was looking at her with that same level attentiveness she'd noticed in the street in Red Bluff, as if she were saying something worth actually hearing. "I don't know," he said. "That's why I need someone who can figure it out." "I can figure it out," Clara said, "but I need full access to every record going back 3 years. Every invoice, every freight receipt, every account book. No exceptions." "Done?" he said. She nodded. "I'll start tomorrow at first light." She went back to her beans. Ethan watched her eat for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, then picked up his coffee again. "You want to know how I knew your name back there?" she said without looking up. "In Red Bluff. You noticed the crowd reacted when you said it." "I did notice that," she said. "My family ranched this land for 20 years, he said. "My father built this place. He died 4 years ago." He paused. "My younger brother died 2 years after that. Stampede." Clara set down her fork. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant that too. "I run the ranch alone now," he said. "Walt and the hands and Dora, but the decisions are mine." He looked into his coffee. "I don't say that to impress you. I say it because you should know what you've come into. It's a working ranch. It's hard work, and I keep my word when I give it." $2 a week plus room and board, Clara said. $2 a week plus room and board, he confirmed. "Sunday's your own." Clara picked up her fork again. "Then we understand each other," she said. They did not speak again that evening. But the silence between them, Clara noticed, had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance. It was the beginning of a different kind of silence, the kind that exists between people who have said what needs to be said and found it sufficient. She was back in her room by 8 o'clock. She sat at the desk for an hour before bed and opened Silas's ledger to the entries she remembered. In the lamplight, with no noise and no Silas and no freight to shelve, she could look at them properly for the first time. The entries were in Silas's handwriting. Amounts ranging from $40 to $120 recorded under a category he had labeled simply Estate, with a date beside each entry. Clara stared at the word estate for a long moment. Her mother had owned something. Clara had always known this in an abstract way. Ruth Whitfield had come from a family with property, and when she'd married Clara's father, she had brought a small inheritance with her. Clara's father had died when Clara was 8, and after that, Ruth had managed alone quietly, with the careful efficiency she had apparently passed to her daughter. But Silas had handled Ruth's affairs after her death, had managed the estate such as it was, had moved Clara into the trading post, and told her there was nothing left, that Ruth had spent it all, that the estate was debts and obligations, that Clara was lucky to have even a cot and a meal. Clara looked at the figures in the ledger. $40, $70, $120, $60, $95, recorded over 4 years. Under the label, estate. That was money coming in from somewhere. That was money Silas had recorded receiving and had never mentioned. Her hands were entirely still on the ledger. Her breathing was careful and deliberate. She turned to the next page, and the next. The entries continued through 3 years of records irregular in timing, but consistent in source, And then they stopped 2 years ago, and what replaced them was a new category labeled simply land, and a single entry of $400, received once 18 months ago, and nothing after. Clara sat back in her chair. She was a woman who understood accounts. She understood that money did not generate itself and did not disappear without a record. Money came from somewhere and went somewhere, and if you were patient and precise, and willing to follow the numbers without flinching from where they led, you could usually find both ends of the thread. She had a thread. She would follow it. She closed the ledger, set it precisely in the center of the desk, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 6 years. She was at the ranch's main account desk before sunrise with a cup of Dora's coffee, and every ledger the ranch had produced in 3 years stacked in 2 neat piles beside her. Walt Briggs, arriving to start his morning rounds, found her there and stopped in the doorway. "You need anything?" he asked. "I need to know who kept records before me," she said without looking up. "And whether any of them are still on the property." "Tom Hicks kept them last," Walt said. Before Tom, it was a temporary man name of Garfield who stayed 3 months and left owing money. Before that, Ethan kept them himself. "Is Tom Hicks still here?" "Left in the spring. Got a place of his own up north." "All right." She dipped her pen. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." Walt stood there a moment longer. "You find something wrong," he said. "I'll tell you when I know what I've found," she said. "For now, I'm only looking." Walt nodded once, the nod of a man who respects precision, and left her to it. What she found over the course of that first morning was a disaster. Not dishonesty as it turned out. Not in the ranch records anyway. What she found in Callaway Ranch's supply ledgers was the accumulated chaos of 3 different men recording the same kinds of transactions in 3 entirely different systems, cross-referencing nothing, reconciling nothing, and collectively producing a set of books that were technically accurate in their individual pieces and completely incoherent as a whole. She estimated Ethan was losing approximately $8 a month to untracked discrepancies. Not theft, not fraud. Simply the mathematical consequence of no one ever comparing incoming invoices against outgoing payments, against inventory counts, against the accounts she was currently reading. $8 a month. $96 a year. Over 3 years, that was close to $300 dissolved into confusion. She was still working when Ethan appeared at noon, with a plate of food she had not asked for, and did not particularly want to stop working for, but she ate it because she noticed hungry again. "How bad is it?" he said. "You're losing $8 a month to untracked discrepancies," she said. "Not theft. Disorganization. I can fix it." "How long?" "I'll have a clean set of books by end of week. I'll have a system running by end of the month that will prevent the same problem going forward." She paused. "You're also being overbilled by your dry goods supplier. 17 cents per unit on your cornmeal order, which adds up to approximately $3 a month. I'll need to write a letter of dispute." Ethan sat down in the chair across from her desk. He had that expression again, the considering one, the one that felt disconcertingly like being actually seen. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Clara," she said without thinking. And then, surprised by herself, "If you prefer." "Clara," he said. And something about the way he said it, straightforward, respectful, without any of the particular weight men sometimes gave a woman's first name when they wanted her to know they'd been granted something, made her feel unexpectedly that it was all right. "Have you eaten anything today besides what I just brought you? I had coffee before sunrise. Dora's going to have opinions about that. Tell her I'm efficient, not negligent." She looked up from the ledger. "I'll eat proper meals. I just needed to understand the scope first." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer. "You always lead with the work?" he asked. It wasn't a criticism. It was a genuine question. "Work is what I can control," Clara said, and she meant it as a simple statement of fact. But something shifted in Ethan's face when she said it, something that looked for just a moment like recognition. He nodded slowly. "I reckon I understand that," he said. She believed him. The first week at Callaway Ranch passed in the rhythm of labor. Early mornings, long hours at the desk afternoons, walking the property with Walt to understand the supply chain. She was now responsible for tracking evenings with Dora, learning the kitchen accounts. The ranch hands watched her with the cautious assessment of men uncertain what to make of a woman who arrived with a bloody lip and a ledger, and immediately started asking questions about their freight receipts. None of them were unkind. 3 of them were eventually helpful. A hand named Cooper Young and Ernest took it upon himself to make sure she always had a full cup of coffee at the desk. An older man named Harlan, who had been with the Calloway family since Ethan's father's time, stopped by the desk 3 evenings in a row before finally saying gruffly that she had her numbers right about the feed supplier's delivery weights, and he'd been saying the same thing himself for a year, and nobody had listened. "Then we agree," Clara said. "Write it down and sign it. I'm putting together a formal record." Harlan looked at her with something that was almost, she thought, admiration. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he did. The only person who did not watch her with caution or assessment was Ethan Calloway, who watched her when he watched her at all, with the same level directness he had shown from the first moment in Red Bluff. Not calculating, not performing, just present. He left coffee outside her door in the mornings before she woke. She noticed this on the 3rd morning when she opened her door at 4:30 and nearly tripped over the cup. It was still hot. She did not mention it. She drank the coffee and went to work. On the 4th evening, she found a split in the left sleeve of his work shirt. When she passed the kitchen, it had been left over a chair waiting for repair, and Dora's hands were already occupied with mending 3 pairs of work trousers. Clara sat down without being asked and had the sleeve repaired in 20 minutes, working by lamplight with the small, precise stitches she had learned from her mother. She folded the shirt and left it on the chair and went to bed. He didn't mention it either. But the next morning, there were 2 cups of coffee outside her door. She discovered the missing cattle sale money on the 6th day. She had been reconciling the previous year's livestock records against the bank deposit records Walt had provided, cross-referencing sale dates and animal counts, and per-head prices against actual deposits. And there it was. A cattle sale from 8 months ago, 42 head sold at $9 per head, $378 total receipt recorded, but the corresponding bank deposit was $38 short. Not $8, not a rounding error. $38. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went back through the records and found 2 more. 3 separate sales over the past 18 months. Discrepancies of $31, $38, and $44 respectively. $113 total received by the ranch and not deposited. She put her pen down. This was not disorganization. She was still sitting there, her hands flat on the desk on either side of the open ledger, when Ethan came in from the afternoon pasture work. He was dusty and tired, and he took one look at her face and stopped in the doorway. "What?" he said. "I need you to sit down," Clara said. He sat. She laid it out for him exactly as she had found it. The dates, the amounts, the discrepancy between receipt records and deposits. She did not editorialize. She simply presented the facts in the order she had found them and let the numbers speak. When she finished, Ethan was very quiet for a moment. "Tom Hicks kept the records during that period," he said finally. "Yes?" Clara said. "The handwriting on the sale receipts is consistent with the ledger entries he made in other records. I can show you the comparison." Ethan looked at the ledger. His jaw was tight. His hands on the desk were still. $113, he said. "Yes." "That's 2 months of wages for the whole crew." "Yes." He breathed out through his nose. "Do you have enough to take to the sheriff?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I have enough to establish a strong pattern of discrepancy. Whether it constitutes proof of intent depends on whether Hicks can provide an accounting of the missing funds." She paused. "I can prepare the documentation. What you do with it is your decision." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You're very careful about that," he said, "about not making decisions that aren't yours to make." "I've had decisions made for me without my consent for 6 years, Clara said. "I don't do that to other people." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "No," he said quietly. I don't reckon you would. He reached across and closed the ledger gently, and his hand brushed her fingers in the process, a contact so brief she might have imagined it, except that she didn't imagine things. I'll handle Tom Hicks, he said. You prepare the documentation. Already started, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Clara, he said. Thank you, he said. And the simplicity of it, no performance, no inflation. Just two plain words offered without debt attached, stopped something in her chest, for just a moment before she breathed again. It's what you're paying me for, she said. It isn't actually, he said. I'm paying you for the supply ledgers. This is considerably more than that. She looked at her pen. I notice things, she said. I've always noticed things. It's not something I can turn off. I know, he said. I noticed that. He left to send word to the sheriff in town, and Clara sat alone at the desk in the failing afternoon light and pressed her fingertips against the closed cover of the ledger and thought about the other ledger, Silas's ledger, with its estate entries and its $400 land payment. She had not forgotten. She had simply been waiting until she had enough ground under her feet to look at the rest clearly. She was starting to have ground. 3 days later, a ranch hand named Pete Grover came in from the north pasture with a gash on his forearm, where a wire fence had caught him a clean cut, but deep and bleeding steadily by the time he made it to the yard. Dora had gone to town with Walt. Ethan was out at the far pasture. Clara set down her pen, assessed the wound, went to the kitchen for the supply box, and had the cut cleaned, packed, and bound before Pete fully registered that the bookkeeper was the one treating him. That's you done this before, ma'am, he said, watching her work with eyes slightly wide. Yes, she said. Hold still. Where'd you learn? My mother, she said. And 6 years of being the only person in a building who thought ahead. Pete was quiet for a moment while she secured the binding. You're real different than we thought you'd be, he said finally. Clara looked up from the bandage. What did you think I'd be? He had the grace to look sheepish. Fragile, I reckon. The boss brought you in looking like someone had hurt you. We thought... He stopped. Wasn't our place to think anything. No, Clara said, not unkindly. But for what it's worth, I'm not fragile. I've just had a very long time to learn how to absorb impact. Pete looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more of lately around the ranch. The particular look of a person revising an assumption they hadn't realized they were making. Yes, ma'am, he said. She secured the last knot and sat back. Change the dressing tomorrow morning. If it goes red at the edges, come find me before you go to Ethan. Yes, ma'am, he said again, and there was something different in it this time. Not gratitude exactly, more like the beginning of simple, unpretentious regard. She returned to the desk. She dipped her pen. She was building something here. She could feel it in the architecture of each day, the accounts growing cleaner, the ranch hand's wariness slowly becoming something else. The coffee outside her door each morning and the small ordinary transactions of shared labor that were. She understood somewhere below full consciousness the way trust actually worked. It was not the trust she was used to, transactional, conditional, liable to be revoked the moment she failed to perform. This was the kind built from the accumulation of small moments that didn't require anything in return. She was trying not to count on it. She was trying at the same time not to dismantle it before it had a chance to exist. On the 10th night, she sat on the porch after supper because the evening air had briefly relented from the summer's violence, and there was something approaching bearable in the temperature, and Ethan came out and sat in the chair beside her without asking and without saying anything, and they listened to the coyotes calling across the dark range. After a long time, he said, "My brother's name was James." Clara did not look at him. She understood instinctively that this required the particular respect of not being watched. "He was 28 when he died," Ethan said. "He was the easy one. The one people liked right away." A pause. "I was always the one you had to get used to." "Some things worth having take time," Clara said. Ethan was quiet. Then, "Is that experience talking?" "It's observation," she said. Then, after a moment, "and maybe some experience." Neither of them said anything else. The coyotes called, and the night settled around Callaway Ranch, and Clara Whitfield sat in a chair on a porch that was not hers, and felt cautiously, tentatively, with every instinct she owned, still watching for the catch almost safe. She was not going to say that out loud, but she was going to stay. She was going to find out what Silas had done with her mother's money. And she was going to do it from here, from this desk, from this porch, from this place, where someone left coffee outside her door before dawn and said thank you without attaching a price. That was enough for now. That was, she thought, pressing her hands flat on her knees and watching the stars come out one by one over the Arizona desert, more than enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was from Red Bluff before Walt handed it to her because it had no return address, and the handwriting on the outside was not Silas's. Silas never wrote his own letters when he could pay someone else to do it. But the ink was the same, cheap brown-black she had bought for the trading post every 6 weeks for 6 years. And she recognized it the way you recognize the smell of a place you were unhappy in. She set it on the desk without opening it and finished the column she was adding. Walt watched her from the doorway. "You going to open that?" "In a minute," she said. She finished the column, checked it, set down her pen. Then she picked up the letter and opened it with the same precise efficiency she applied to everything. It was not from Silas directly. It was from a man named Gerald Hatch, who identified himself as a solicitor operating out of Tucson and who wrote in the particular dense, weaponized language of legal correspondence designed to obscure simple intentions behind complicated words. The simple intention, once Clara had stripped it down, was this: Silas Whitfield was asserting that Clara had left his household in possession of property belonging to him, specifically a ledger book containing business records, and he was demanding its return within 10 days, or he would pursue legal remedy. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down. "Problem," Walt said. "Opportunity," Clara said. She picked up her pen and began writing a response. She wrote it in 3 drafts. The first draft being the letter she wanted to write, which was precise and comprehensive and anatomized every discrepancy she had found in Silas's records going back 4 years. The second draft being a shorter version that made the same points without the full evidence. The third draft being what she actually sent a single paragraph informing Mr. Gerald Hatch that the ledger in question had been the working record of Whitfield & Sons trading post and contained entries she had made in the course of her employment, that she had questions about certain of those entries that she believed a territorial court would find equally interesting, and that she would welcome the opportunity to discuss the matter before any legal proceedings were initiated. She signed it, sealed it, handed it to Walt with money for the post. "What did you write?" Walt asked. "A polite invitation for him to reconsider," Clara said, and went back to work. She told Ethan that evening. She laid the solicitor's letter on the table between them at supper, watched him read it, watched the line of his jaw go tight, and then deliberately release. "He wants the ledger back," Ethan said. "He wants the evidence gone," Clara said. "The ledger is the excuse." Ethan looked up. "What evidence?" She had been waiting for the right moment to tell him everything. This was the moment. She told him about the estate entries, about the irregular payments recorded over 4 years under a label that had no corresponding invoice, no freight receipt, no business explanation, about the $400 land entry 18 months ago that stood alone in the record like a door that had been closed too fast. She told him what she believed it meant, that her mother had left something money, property, land rights, or some combination, and that Silas had been collecting income from it for years while telling Clara there was nothing. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder whether she had miscalculated, whether this was too much, too complicated, too far outside the scope of what he had offered her. Then he said, "What do you need?" Just that. What do you need? Not "are you sure?" And not "that's a serious accusation," and not the particular skeptical half-frown she had practiced reading on men's faces for years. Something in her chest did a complicated thing. I need to get to the county land records office in Prescott, she said, keeping her voice even. If my mother owned property, there will be a deed. If the deed was transferred, there will be a record of that too. If Silas sold something that belonged to my mother's estate without legal authority, that's not a civil matter. That's fraud. Prescott is 2 days' ride, Ethan said. I know. I can take you Saturday. You don't have to. Clara. He said her name the way he always said it, straight and simple and without decoration. I have business at the land office anyway. Fence line dispute with a neighbor that needs the survey records. I was going next month. I'll go Saturday instead. He picked up his coffee cup. Unless you'd rather go alone. She considered it honestly. She was capable of going alone. She had $12. No, she had $12 plus 3 weeks' pay, which was $18, which was enough. But Prescott was 2 days' ride, and she didn't know the road, and Ethan Calloway's name in this territory apparently meant something, and she acknowledged to herself with only a small internal argument, safer with him than without him. Saturday, she said. Saturday. He agreed. They left before dawn with 2 horses and enough provisions for the road, and Clara brought her personal record book and every note she had made about the ledger entries organized into a leather folder she had stitched together from scraps in the supply room. The ride to Prescott was long and largely silent, but it was a different silence from their first ride together. This one had texture to it, the comfortable silence of people who had already said the important things and didn't need to fill the air to prove they were present. Once around mid-morning of the first day, Ethan said, "My father bought this land in 1859, fought for every acre of it." "Did he get to see it become what it is?" Clara asked. "Long enough," Ethan said. "He died knowing it was solid." A pause. "James would have expanded it south. He always wanted the grazing land by the creek." Another pause longer. "I think about what he'd say about the dry summer. Probably something ridiculous that would make everyone laugh." "What would you say about it?" Ethan thought about it. "I'd say we need to dig the secondary well faster and stop pretending the creek won't run low." "Practical," Clara said. "James called it boring," Ethan said. "Said I never learned to make a problem sound interesting." "Problems don't need to sound interesting," Clara said. "They need to get solved." Ethan glanced at her sidelong. "You two would have argued about that constantly," he said. And then, as if surprised by himself, "He would have liked you." Clara looked at the road ahead. "I think I would have liked him," she said carefully. "But I'm glad it's you here. James sounds like he would have tried to make me laugh when I was trying to concentrate." Ethan made a sound. It took her a moment to identify it. It was a laugh short and genuine, and slightly rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. She found herself smiling at the road. They camped one night on the trail and reached Prescott by noon of the second day, and Clara went directly to the county land records office while Ethan took the horses to the livery and went to handle his fence line dispute. The clerk at the records office was a small, harried man named Mr. Fenn, who clearly did not see many women asking to search deed records and who clearly did not know how to process this information in a way that avoided either condescension or excessive helpfulness. Clara gave him no opportunity for either. "I'm looking for any property deed recorded under the name Ruth Whitfield," she said, or Ruth Darnell, which was her maiden name, in the 10 years prior to 1872, and any subsequent transfer of deed recorded after 1872 from either name. Please. Mr. Fenn found the records in 20 minutes. Ruth Whitfield née Darnell had owned a parcel of land and a standing house outside of Red Bluff, Arizona territory, 12 acres of building, a water right to a seasonal creek that ran through the northeast corner of the property. The deed was recorded in 1869, transferred from Ruth's own father's estate. Ruth had owned it outright, no lien, no debt, no encumbrance. In 1874, 2 years after Ruth's death, the deed had been transferred to Silas Whitfield. Clara's hand was completely steady on the desk. She had known this was likely. She had followed the numbers here precisely because she expected this. She had prepared herself, and yet reading her mother's name on that deed, and then reading the date the land had been taken from under it, she felt something move through her that she had not entirely prepared for. Not grief exactly, something older than grief. The particular ache of understanding finally the full shape of what had been done to you. "I need a certified copy of both documents," she said. Her voice was steady. "The original deed and the transfer." "That'll be whatever it costs," she said. "Please." She was sitting on the steps outside the land records office with the certified copies in her folder when Ethan found her 20 minutes later. He took one look at her face and sat down beside her on the step without saying anything. She showed him the documents. He read them. He was quiet. "He transferred it to himself," Ethan said, 2 years after your mother died. "With no living adult witness I can find, and no court oversight," Clara said. "My mother had no will recorded here. In the absence of a will, the property should have gone to her nearest blood heir." She paused. "That's me. I was 16 and he was my guardian, and he used that to take what was mine." Ethan set the documents down. His hands on his knees were very still. "And the $400 in the ledger," he said. "He sold the land," Clara said, 18 months ago, to whoever is currently developing the railroad corridor in that part of the territory." She had checked the secondary records while Mr. Fenn was making the copies. The parcel had been sold to a Tucson landholding company that Clara recognized now as the company associated with the speculator who had been in Silas's back room the day she was thrown out. "He'd been collecting income from the water right for years. Those are the estate entries. Then he sold the land outright for $400. "Your land," Ethan said. "My mother's land," Clara said, "which was supposed to come to me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said with a careful evenness that she recognized as controlled anger, "What do we do?" Clara had been thinking about this since Prescott had appeared on the horizon. "The territorial attorney's office is 3 blocks from here," she said. "I have the deed. I have the transfer document with a signature that may not hold up to scrutiny. I have the ledger entries showing income received from the property that was never disclosed to me as the legal heir. And I have 3 years of my own unpaid labor that constitutes under territorial law a debt owed." "That's enough to open a case," Ethan said. "It's enough to open a case," Clara agreed. "Whether it's enough to win one depends on things I don't control." She paused. "But I'm not asking for your help with that part. That's mine to handle." Ethan looked at her directly. "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering to handle it. I was asking what we do, in terms of how I can support what you're doing." The distinction landed on Clara with a quiet force she hadn't expected. "Come with me to the attorney's office," she said. "Not to speak for me, just to be there," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go," he said. The territorial attorney, a heavy-set man named Aldous Crane, who had intelligent eyes behind thick spectacles, listened to Clara for 45 minutes without interruption. He examined the deed. He examined the transfer. He examined the ledger entries she had transcribed, noting the dates and amounts. He asked 6 precise questions, all of which Clara answered without hesitation. At the end, he looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Whitfield, you're telling me you kept personal records of your own labor during this period?" "Yes, sir. 3 years of daily records. Hours worked, tasks performed, estimated fair market value for each category of labor." Crane looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing because he understood this was not his moment to speak. "And you're prepared to sign an affidavit to the facts as you've presented them?" Crane said. "Yes, sir," Clara said. Crane set down the documents. He folded his hands on his desk. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I've been practicing law in this territory for 19 years, and I will tell you honestly that cases of this nature estate, fraud, improper guardianship, unpaid labor are not simple. They take time. They face resistance. Men like your uncle have resources and connections, and they use both." He paused. But I will also tell you that the documentation you've presented is among the clearest I've seen for a case of this kind. You've done most of my work for me." Clara felt something in her chest that was equal parts relief and resolution. "What's the next step?" she asked. "I'll petition with the territorial court to have the 1874 deed transfer reviewed," Crane said. "In the meantime, I strongly recommend you do not return the ledger. Whatever correspondence you've received from a solicitor in Tucson, ignore it, and forward all future correspondence to me." He looked at her steadily. "And I recommend you stay out of Red Bluff until this is resolved." "I understand," Clara said. She and Ethan rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, fuller weighted with the specific gravity of something having been set in motion that could not be unset. On the first night of the return ride, sitting beside the small fire with her notes spread across her knees, Clara said, "I'm not going to let this make me afraid." Ethan looked at her from across the fire. "I spent 6 years afraid in that building," she said. "Afraid of what Silas would do if I complained. Afraid to leave because I had nowhere to go. Afraid to stay because I could feel what it was doing to me." She looked at her notes. "I'm not going to let the next part of this be afraid too. Whatever happens with the court, whatever Silas does, I'm going to be the one who decides how I stand." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know he won't let this go quietly," he said. "Not a warning. A statement of fact offered between people who deal in facts." "No," Clara agreed. "He won't. He'll come at you," Ethan said. "Might be through the solicitor, might be something uglier." "I know. I want you to know," Ethan said, and his voice was deliberate and careful in a way she had come to recognize as his version of emphasis. "That whatever he does, whatever direction it comes from, you are not handling it alone. Not because you can't, but because you don't have to." Clara looked at him across the fire. The firelight did things to his face that the flat Arizona sun didn't soften the lines around his eyes, made him look for a moment less like the careful, closed-off man she'd first seen in Red Bluff, and more like the person she'd been slowly assembling from all the small evidence of who he actually was. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name without catching herself and correcting it. He noticed. She saw him notice. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "Long ride tomorrow." She closed her notes. She lay down on her bedroll and listened to the fire settle and the horses shift, and somewhere in the distance a coyote call and be answered by another, and she thought about her mother's land. 12 acres, and a house, and a water right. And about what it meant that the land had existed all this time, hers by rights, while she had been sleeping on a cot in a back room thinking there was nothing. There had always been something. She fell asleep thinking about that. They were 2 hours from the ranch the next afternoon when they saw the rider coming south on the road at speed. It was Cooper, the young hand with the earnest face who kept her coffee full, and he pulled up short when he spotted them, and his expression was tight in a way that made Clara's chest close down before he'd said a word. "Boss," Cooper said, slightly breathless, "you need to know. Man came to the ranch this morning. Big fella said his name was Dobbs. Said he had business with Miss Whitfield." Clara felt the name like a cold hand on her spine. Dobbs. The railroad surveyor from Silas's back room. "What did he want?" Ethan said. His voice had gone very flat. "Said he had a message from her uncle. Wouldn't leave the message with us. Said he'd be back." Cooper looked at Clara. "Walt told him to clear off the property. He went, but Walt said to tell you he didn't go far." Ethan looked at Clara. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Dobbs' arrival at the ranch was not coincidence, and was not simply a message delivery. Dobbs was in that back room the day she was thrown out. Dobbs was connected to the Tucson Land Company that had bought her mother's land. Dobbs was, she now understood with the cold clarity of someone whose numbers had just clicked into alignment, not a railroad surveyor at all, or not only that. He was Silas's connection to the land deal. He was the man who had helped Silas sell what wasn't his to sell, and he had just come to the ranch where she was staying, which meant Silas knew where she was, which meant the timeline she had assumed she had before things escalated had just collapsed. "How long ago?" she said. 3 hours, maybe. Cooper said. She looked at Ethan. I need to get back to the ranch and get to the ledger. Why the ledger? Because if Dobbs is who I think he is, his name is in it, she said. And I need to make sure those pages are copied and secured before anything else happens to them. Ethan put his heels to his horse. They rode the last 2 hours in 40 minutes. Walt was in the yard when they arrived, and the look on his face when he saw them confirmed what Cooper had already said. The situation had not simplified in their absence. Dobbs came back, Walt said before Ethan dismounted. Hour ago. Had another man with him this time. I told them to leave again. They left. He paused. But one of the hands saw them stop on the north road. Just stopped, waiting. Clara was already moving toward the house. She went to the desk. She opened the ledger to the relevant pages. She copied every entry, every date, every amount, 3 full pages of meticulous transcription in her careful hand, with notations in the margins identifying what each entry likely corresponded to, based on what she now knew from the Prescott land records. She made 2 copies. She was sealing the second copy into an envelope addressed to Aldous Crane attorney Prescott when Ethan came in. 1 copy to Crane, she said without turning around. 1 copy in the desk, and I need the original somewhere Dobbs and Silas can't reach it. I'll put it in the lockbox in the barn, Ethan said. Walt has the only other key. Good. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a complete name for something that was partly the same. Controlled anger she'd seen at the attorney's office, and partly something else, something that had more to do with her specifically and the situation she was in, something that she decided after a moment's consideration was concern. Genuine, unperformative concern. He's coming here, she said. Silas. Not just Dobbs. Silas will come. I know, Ethan said. This is your property, she said. This is your ranch. What happens here involves you and your people and I. She stopped, started again. I need you to know that I didn't intend to bring this to your door. If you want me to, Clara. His voice was quiet and absolute. Stop. She stopped. You're not a problem I'm managing, he said. You're a person He paused. Something moved across his face. You're a person on this ranch, my ranch, and what happens on my ranch is my business. He held her gaze. Nobody is dragging you back to anything, not while I'm standing. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first time she'd heard his voice hit her again, and you answer to me, and how she had initially classified it as the intervention of a man who needed to be a hero, needed the performance of protection, needed the story of himself as the person who stepped in. She knew now it wasn't that. He wasn't performing. He was simply the kind of man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and had apparently decided somewhere between a split lip in Red Bluff and a fire on the Prescott Road that she was worth standing beside. All right, she said. All right, he said. She handed him the original ledger. He took it to the lockbox, and Clara Whitfield sat down at her desk in the ranch that was starting to feel like the first solid ground she had stood on in years, and she waited for Silas Whitfield to come collect what he thought was still his. She was no longer the woman who would make it easy for him. Silas came on a Friday morning. Clara heard the horses before she saw anything 4 of them, which was 2 more than she'd expected, and told her immediately that Silas had decided this was a show of force rather than a negotiation. She was at the desk when Cooper knocked on the doorframe and said, voice tight, Miss Whitfield, you need to come out. She capped her ink bottle, set down her pen, smoothed the front of her dress. She walked out into the yard with her hands free and her back straight, and she did not allow herself to hurry. Silas Whitfield sat on a gray horse in the center of the yard with Dobbs on his left, and the Tucson land speculator, whose name she now knew from the Prescott records, was a man called Renner on his right. Behind them was a 4th man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered and carrying himself with the particular blankness of a man paid to intimidate. Walt was already at the yard. 3 ranch hands had drifted into positions that were not accidental. Cooper stood near the water trough with his thumbs in his belt, watching. Ethan came out of the barn. He walked to Clara's left and stopped. He did not reach for his revolver. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside her close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, and waited. Silas looked at Clara the way he had always looked at her, with the particular man who has decided what something is worth, and resents being asked to reconsider. "You've got something of mine," he said. "Good morning, Silas," Clara said. He blinked. He had not expected pleasantries from Clara, who had always responded to his hostility with either silence or deflection, apparently confused him. "Good. The ledger," he said. "And whatever copies you made, I want them." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Clara said. His face went red. "That ledger is the property of Whitfield & Sons Trading Post. You took it when you left without permission, and I want it back. You've got no right to—" "I kept that ledger," Clara said. "Every entry in it in my handwriting is mine. Every entry in your handwriting is evidence." She let that land. "Your solicitor's letter was forwarded to my attorney in Prescott 3 days ago. All future correspondence should be directed to him." The silence in the yard had the quality of a held breath. Silas stared at her. Something was happening in his face. The red was deepening. The contempt curdling into something uglier, something that recognized it was being outmaneuvered and hated the feeling with a violence it wasn't yet expressing. "Your attorney," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "You don't have money for an attorney." "I do now," she said. $2 a week adds up." Dobbs leaned over and said something low to Silas. Silas shook his head without taking his eyes off Clara. "You think you've got something on me," he said. "Some numbers in a book. That's nothing. You're nothing. You're a girl with no family, no land, no standing in any court in this territory, and whatever story you've put together from a few ledger entries is not going to hold against a man of property and—" "The property you stole," Clara said. The words landed in the yard like a stone in still water. "My mother owned 12 acres and a house outside Red Bluff," Clara said, and her voice was level and clear, and she did not look away from Silas's face. "She owned it outright with a water right. She left no recorded will, which means under territorial law her estate passed to her nearest blood heir. That's me. I was 16 years old, and you were my legal guardian, and you used that position to transfer her land deed to yourself 2 years after her death." She paused. "I have the certified copies from the Prescott Land Records Office. I have your ledger entries showing 4 years of income from the property's water right that you collected and never disclosed. And I have the record of your sale of that land to Mr. Renner's company 18 months ago for $400. She let her gaze move briefly to Renner. "Which I suspect Mr. Renner is very interested in discussing, given that the title he purchased may not have been clean." Renner's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way that told Clara her arrow had found the mark. Silas swung down from his horse. He was moving toward her before his feet hit the ground, and the movement was fast and ugly in the way that only a man operating on fury and desperation can move, without calculation, without strategy, simply closing the distance because he couldn't think of anything else to do. Ethan stepped forward. He didn't reach for his revolver. He simply moved one step forward so that he was between Silas and Clara, and he stood there, and the look on his face was not anger and not performance, but simply the absolute refusal of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it. Silas stopped. He was 2 feet from Ethan, and he stopped. "Back up," Ethan said. Quiet, final. "This is between me and her," Silas said. "You stopped having anything between you and her the moment you rode onto my property uninvited," Ethan said. "Back up, Mr. Whitfield." Dobbs had dismounted. The broad-shouldered fourth man had dismounted. Walt moved, and 2 ranch hands moved with him, and the geometry of the yard shifted in a way that made the arithmetic very clear. Silas backed up. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative had become obvious. His face was doing something terrible. The collapse of a man who has built his entire identity on the certainty that people beneath him will stay beneath him, confronting the fact that one of them has stopped. "You've got nothing," he said to Clara, but the conviction had drained out of his voice, and what was left was thinner and more desperate. Whatever you think you have, it'll never hold. Courts cost money. Lawyers cost money. You think this cowboy is going to fund your little crusade forever? You think he's going to— That's enough, Ethan said. She's using you, Silas said, turning on Ethan with the frantic pivot of a man who had run out of angles. You brought her here thinking she was some poor, helpless girl, and she's played you for a fool. She's a manipulator, just like her mother was a manipulator, just like— Silas! Clara's voice cut through cleanly. Stop talking about my mother. Something in the quality of her voice made him stop. It was not loud. It was not heated. It was the voice of a woman who has decided she is done absorbing and has nothing left to lose by saying exactly what is true. My mother worked herself to exhaustion keeping a home and raising a child alone after my father died, Clara said. She kept her property, paid her debts, and left what she had to the only person she loved. You called her manipulative because she wouldn't be grateful for your interference. You called me ungrateful because I noticed what you were doing. She took one step forward, not toward Silas, toward the truth she was saying. You have been calling women difficult your entire life, and what you meant was that we could see you. We could always see you. We just didn't have anywhere else to go. The yard was completely silent. Dobbs was looking at his boots. Renner was looking at something in the middle distance with the expression of a man calculating his own exposure. The broad-shouldered fourth man was looking at Clara with an expression that had started as blankness and was becoming something else, not quite shame, but its close neighbor. Silas looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She had seen his contempt and his cruelty and his drunken self-pity and his blunt, reflexive violence. She had never seen this. He looked, she realized, small. Not physically. Something internal. The particular smallness of a man who has been seen clearly and knows it and can't find a way to dispute it. You'll regret this, he said finally. It was all he had left. No, Clara said. I really don't think I will. Silas looked at Ethan. Whatever he saw in Ethan's face ended the conversation. He remounted his horse. Dobbs remounted. Renner had not dismounted, and now simply wheeled his horse. The fourth man lingered for just a moment. He looked at Clara. He looked like he was going to say something. Then he remounted and followed the others without speaking. They watched the four horses leave the yard and take the south road back toward Red Bluff. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Walt exhaled through his nose and said to no one in particular, "Well," and that was enough. Cooper let out a long breath and looked at Clara with unconcealed admiration. Miss Whitfield, that was something. That was a beginning, Clara said. Not an ending. She turned to Ethan. He'll go to the sheriff, his version. We need to get to Sheriff Ames first. Walt, Ethan said. Already thinking it, Walt said. I'll ride in this afternoon. I'll write the statement now, Clara said, and went back inside to her desk. She wrote for 2 hours. The statement was comprehensive and precise. Dates, amounts, legal references, the specific entries from the ledger cross-referenced against the Prescott deed records. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, without embellishment, without emotional appeal, with the cold and complete clarity of documented fact. Let the numbers do what they did. They were very good at telling the truth. Walt took the statement and a copy of the ledger entries and rode for town. The afternoon passed in an uneasy quiet that everyone on the ranch felt, but nobody spoke. Dora made a supper nobody was particularly hungry for. The hands came and went, with the deliberate purposefulness of people who need to be useful with their hands when their minds are unsettled. Ethan came and sat at the table across from Clara's desk at 5 o'clock. He had a cup of coffee she hadn't heard him pour. You should know, he said, that I meant what I said this morning, about not handling this alone. I know you meant it, Clara said without looking up from the notes she was organizing. I also want you to know that what you did out there. He paused. What you said to him. That wasn't just fighting back. That was something else. She looked up. That was someone deciding they're done apologizing for existing, he said. That's not a small thing. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying something deflecting and efficient, something that moved the conversation forward without sitting in the territory he was opening. She didn't. "I've been deciding that for a while," she said. Today was just the first time I said it out loud, where he could hear it. Ethan nodded slowly, his coffee cup in his hands. "My father used to say that the worst thing a man can do is make someone feel small for as long as it takes them to believe it," he said. "He said the best revenge for that kind of thing is to get big enough that they can't reach you anymore." "Is that what you did?" Clara asked. "After James died." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "After James died, I got small. I just did it quietly enough that nobody noticed." He looked at his cup. "This ranch runs, and the accounts are kept, and the cattle are moved, and to everyone watching, that's a functioning man. But I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't here. Not entirely. Not in a way that mattered." Clara set down her pen. She gave him the full attention that kind of honesty deserved. "And now," she said. He looked up. His eyes were very direct. "Now I'm here," he said simply. They sat with that for a moment, not awkwardly, not performing comfort. Just two people who had said the true thing and were letting it exist between them. Then hoofbeats came up the road, and both of them stood. It was Walt returning faster than expected. And beside him was a man Clara didn't recognize, a lean, precise-looking man, with a badge on his coat, and the measured assessing expression of someone accustomed to arriving after things have already gone wrong. "Sheriff Ames," Ethan said. "Ethan." The sheriff dismounted. He looked at Clara with the same measuring expression. "You'd be Miss Whitfield." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "I've had a very interesting afternoon," Sheriff Ames said. "Your man here reached me before your uncle did, which was fortunate. I've had time to read your statement and look at these ledger copies before listening to Silas Whitfield tell me a story that doesn't match either of them." He looked at the copies Walt had given him. "I've also had a wire back from the territorial court in Prescott confirming that an attorney named Crane filed a petition this morning regarding the deed in question." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "Silas Whitfield is currently at the jail in Red Bluff," Sheriff Ames continued. "Not under arrest, not yet, but under what I would call a strong suggestion that he remain available for questioning." He looked at Clara. "I have some questions for you as well, Miss Whitfield, if you're willing." "Yes, sir," Clara said immediately. "Whatever you need." She answered his questions for an hour at the kitchen table. Ethan sat at the end of the table and said nothing, which was exactly what she needed him to do. Ames was thorough and professional, and he asked the same questions twice in different ways. The way a man who is building a case checks his mortar, and Clara answered both versions with the same precision. When it was done, Ames gathered his notes. "I'll need the original ledger," he said. "It's in the lockbox in the barn," Ethan said. They retrieved it. Clara watched Ames receive it with the particular quiet of someone watching something important move out of their hands and into the hands of the process that will determine what it means. "What happens now?" she asked. "The territorial court will review the deed transfer," Ames said. "That's civil, and it'll take some months. The financial fraud, the estate income he collected without disclosure, that's criminal, and that moves faster." He paused. "Renner is a complication. The land company has lawyers. That part will be contested." He looked at Clara steadily. "I won't promise you easy, but I'll tell you that what you've brought me is solid. Better documented than half the cases I've ever built myself." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara said. He left as the last light was going from the sky. Clara stood in the yard after his horse disappeared down the road and breathed the night air and felt under the fear and the tension and the accumulated weight of the day. Something she identified after a moment as satisfaction. Clean and precise, and hers. She had done this. She had followed the numbers. She had prepared the documentation. She had stood in the yard this morning and said the true thing and not run from it. Whatever came next, the courts, Renner's lawyers, the months of uncertain process, she had built the foundation of it herself, with her own hands and her own mind, and 6 years of noticing things that people assumed she wasn't noticing. Ethan came and stood beside her. "You should eat something," he said. I know, she said. Dora's going to have strong opinions. She always does. Neither of them moved for a moment. Thank you, Clara said quietly, for this morning, for standing there. I told you I would, he said. You did, she said. I'm still thanking you. She heard him exhale, not quite a sigh, something more like a release. You don't have to thank me for that, Clara. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she turned to look at him, and in the particular honesty of exhaustion and relief, and the awareness of something having shifted, not just today, not just in the yard with Silas, but over weeks of coffee left outside doors, and sleeves mended, and ledgers filled, and nights on the porch listening to coyotes, and all of that, she found she was not afraid of what she saw in his face. She had been cataloging him carefully for weeks in the way she cataloged everything, looking for the cost, the conditional, the thing hidden under the offer. She had not found it. What she had found in its place was simply this: a man who said what he meant, and stood where he said he would stand, and had been without announcement or theater, becoming the kind of safe she had stopped believing in. She didn't say any of that. She wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but she thought it, and she let herself think it. And that was already more than she had allowed herself in a very long time. Let's go eat, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. They went inside. 3 days later, the letter from Aldous Crane arrived. Clara opened it at the desk with her coffee, and read it twice, and then set it down with both hands flat on the desk and stared at it. Ethan came in from the morning rounds and took one look at her face. What now? The territorial court has issued a preliminary ruling, she said. The 1874 deed transfer has been flagged for full review on grounds of improper guardianship procedure. She paused. They've also frozen any further transactions on the property by Renner's company pending the outcome. Ethan went still. That's good. That's very good, Clara said. But there's more. She looked at the letter. Crane found a second document. In the probate records, something that wasn't properly filed at the time of my mother's death. A letter of instruction. She stopped. Clara. Ethan's voice was careful. What kind of letter? My mother wrote it 3 months before she died, Clara said. She wrote it to a notary in Prescott who apparently never received it. It was found in a secondary file misfiled under the wrong name, which Crane believes was not accidental. She steadied her voice. In it, she names me as sole heir to the land, the water right, and a bank account in Prescott holding $160. The number sat in the air between them. $160. A bank account. Open for 20 years, collecting interest under a name that Silas had apparently not known to look for. He didn't get all of it, Clara said, and her voice was very quiet. He stole everything he could find, and he missed this. Ethan crossed the room. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the full direct attention she had come to understand was his form of presence, not hovering, not performing, just completely there. Your mother hid something for you, he said. She hid something for me, Clara said. She looked at the letter. She thought about Ruth Whitfield, the quiet, precise, capable woman she had been trying to live up to for 22 years. The woman who had taught her to keep records. The woman who had apparently in the last months of her life, and knowing she was ill, filed a letter with a notary, and made sure, as much as she could make sure from where she stood, that Clara would have something. That Clara would not be left with nothing. The tears came without warning, and Clara, who almost never cried, who had been practicing not crying for 6 years as a survival strategy, found she had no defense against them. Not the devastating kind of tears. Just the plain human kind that come when something you have been holding against a wound for a very long time is finally allowed to be set down. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Ethan did not say anything. He did not reach for her, or make the kind of soothing sounds that would have required her to manage his discomfort. He simply stayed where he was, present and steady, and let her have it. After a moment, she breathed. She lowered her hand. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "I don't usually." "Clara," he said, and his voice was very gentle. "You just found out your mother tried to take care of you even from the edge of her own death. You're allowed to feel that." She looked at him. "You've been careful," he said quietly. "So precise, so completely in control of every single thing within your reach. For weeks I've watched you come into a strange place and make order out of chaos and stand in a yard and face down a man who hurt you and not flinch once." He paused. "You're allowed 1 minute of not being in control." She looked at her hands on the desk. They were trembling slightly. "1 minute?" she said. "I'll time it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was so carefully, precisely kind that she almost laughed. She didn't quite laugh, but something in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time unclenched just slightly in the direction of it. She pressed her hand flat on the letter. "She thought Ruth Whitfield loved you. She planned ahead for you. She did what she could. She thought you found it. After 22 years and 6 years in that building, and 14 miles on a borrowed horse, and 2 days to Prescott, and a yard full of hired men, you found it." "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm done." "Fully 60 seconds," Ethan said solemnly. This time she did laugh, a short, real, slightly unsteady sound that surprised her. Ethan looked at her when she laughed. His expression did something she had not seen it do before. Something that was not his considered attentiveness, or his quiet anger, or his careful concern. Something simpler and more unguarded than any of those. She filed it. She would examine it later when she had room. "I need to write to Crane," she said. "And I need to ask him about accessing the bank account and what documentation the court will require to establish my claim to it." "Write the letter," Ethan said. "I also need to find out whether the frozen land transaction affects Renner's liability and whether we can use it as leverage in the criminal fraud case against Silas." "Write that in the letter too," Ethan said. "And I need to eat something because I haven't since last night." "That one I can solve right now," he said and stood up. He brought her a plate from the kitchen without ceremony and set it on the corner of the desk where she could reach it without moving the letter, and went to pour himself more coffee, and returned and sat across from her while she wrote and ate. And the morning went on around them, Walt calling to a hand in the yard, horses in the barn, Dora singing something off-key in the kitchen, the ordinary living sounds of a place that continued existing, regardless of the extraordinary things happening inside it. Clara wrote the letter to Crane. She ate every bite on the plate. She organized her notes. She thought once about the fact that the desk she was sitting at in the room she was sitting in on the ranch she had arrived at 3 weeks ago with $12 and a stolen ledger, and a split lip, had somehow become the place from which she was conducting the legal reclamation of her entire life. She thought about what Ethan had said. "You're not a problem I'm managing. You're a person." She thought about her mother's letter filed 20 years ago with a notary in Prescott, waiting in a misfiled folder for someone precise enough to find it. She thought, "I found it, Mama. I'm here." She sealed the letter to Crane. Outside, she heard hoofbeats, a single rider coming up the north road fast, which was unusual enough that she lifted her head and listened. Walt's voice called across the yard. "Boss, boss, you need to come out. There's smoke coming from the south ridge." Ethan was already moving before Walt finished the sentence. Clara set down her pen and stood, and the cold presentiment that had been sitting in the back of her mind since Silas rode away 3 days ago clicked into sudden cold focus. Silas would not take this quietly. She had known that. She followed Ethan out of the door and into the yard and looked south where Walt was pointing, and she saw it, a column of dark smoke rising from the direction of the hay shed, thick and fast, and already large enough to mean the fire had been burning for longer than anyone had noticed. And in the same moment that she registered the smoke, she registered that the ranch hand Pete was not in the yard, and that Pete had mentioned at breakfast he was going to check the hay shed inventory this morning, and that the hay shed was where the smoke was coming from. "Pete," she said. Ethan was already running. Clara ran after him, and she was not afraid. She was thinking, calculating distance and smoke volume, and time elapsed, and the location of the water barrels, and the direction of the wind, and she was running with her skirt in her hands and her boots hitting the dry ground. And somewhere behind her, she could hear the whole ranch mobilizing Walt, shouting horses being moved away from the direction of the fire, and she was thinking, the lockbox is in the barn, not the hay shed, the ledger is safe, the copies are with Crane. The letter is sealed, and then she was thinking Pete. The hay shed was fully burning when they reached it. The doors were closed. Ethan hit the hay shed doors with his shoulder, and they gave not locked, just swollen with heat, and the smoke that rolled out was immediate and thick, and the kind that gets into your lungs before your brain registers what's happening. Pete! Ethan's voice cut through the roar of the fire. An answer came from the far left corner. Coughing ragged, but an answer. Clara did not stop at the threshold. She pulled the collar of her dress up over her mouth and went in behind Ethan, and the heat was a wall she walked through rather than around, and she could hear the fire eating the dry timber above them, with a sound like something enormous and hungry, and she was not thinking about fear. She was thinking about the left corner and the distance to it, and whether the roof was going to hold. Pete was on the ground, one leg pinned under a fallen support beam that the fire had weakened from above. The beam was not yet burning, but the hay around it was, and Pete was conscious and coughing and trying to push himself free with both arms and not getting anywhere. Ethan reached him first. He got his hands under the beam and lifted. Clara saw the effort in every line of his body, the muscles in his forearms, the set of his jaw, and the beam moved 3 inches, which was enough. "Pull him," Ethan said. Clara grabbed Pete under both arms and pulled, and Pete made a sound that was partly pain and partly relief, and came free from under the beam, and Ethan dropped it and got Pete's other arm over his shoulder, and they moved for the door. The roof made a sound Clara would remember for the rest of her life, a deep cracking groan of something giving up its structure. They were through the doors when it came down. The rush of heat behind them was enough to push all 3 of them forward into the yard, and Clara went to her knees in the dirt with Pete half across her and coughed until her eyes watered. And when she could see again, Walt was there, and 2 hands were lifting Pete, and Ethan was beside her, with his hand on her back, and the hay shed behind them was collapsing in on itself in a roar of fire and smoke. "You're all right," Ethan said. It was not a question. He was checking his hand on her back, his eyes on her face checking. "I'm all right," she said. She looked at his face. There was soot along his jaw, and his shirt was scorched at the left shoulder, and his eyes were still doing what they did when he was frightened, going very still and very direct, like everything that was not essential had been stripped away. "Pete," she said. "He's breathing," Walt said from 10 feet away. "Leg might be broken. He's breathing." Clara exhaled. She sat in the dirt of the yard and breathed and let herself do it. Let the shaking come and pass. Let her body have the 20 seconds it needed to understand that it was outside and not inside, that the roof had come down behind her and not on her, that she was on solid ground. Then she stood up. She looked at the burning shed. And then she looked at the road. "Silas did this," she said. "Or Dobbs," Ethan said. He was standing beside her close, and his voice had the flat, controlled quality of anger that has found a direction. Either way, same order. "Someone on foot could have reached that shed from the south road without being seen from the yard," Clara said. "If they came early morning before the hands were all out. Sheriff Ames needs to know," Walt said. "He needs to know everything," Clara said. "The arson, Pete, the timing." She turned to Ethan. "This changes the criminal case. Obstructing justice, destruction of property, attempted evidence tampering. This isn't just the estate fraud anymore." "I know," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I need to write to Crane again." "I know," he said again. And then, "Clara, are you actually all right? Are you?" She understood the question beneath the question, not about the smoke or the heat, about the whole of it, the fire and Silas and the deed and the letter, and the 22 years of accumulation that had brought her to this exact moment, standing in a yard with soot on her dress, and her mother's legal case in the hands of a territorial court. "Yes," she said, And then, because it was true and she was done being imprecise about the true things, because I'm not alone in it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, the unguarded thing she had seen when she laughed back at the desk, but larger now and closer to the surface. He did not say anything, but he nodded once slowly, and the nod meant something without needing it translated. Walt rode for town before noon. Clara wrote 2 letters, one to Crane, one directly to the Territorial Marshal's office in Prescott, documenting the arson and its connection to the ongoing fraud case, with the same precise, comprehensive language she brought to everything. She included the timing, the proximity to Silas's visit 3 days prior, the injury to Pete, the loss of the hay shed, and a formal request that the Marshal's office open an independent investigation into Silas Whitfield and Gerald Dobbs. She sealed both letters. She wrote the addresses in her careful, even hand. She set them on the corner of the desk. Then she went to check on Pete. He was in the bunkhouse with his leg splinted. Walt had done it before, riding out efficiently and without fuss, and he was pale but coherent, and trying to pretend the pain was less than it was, in the way of young men who believe discomfort should be private. Clara sat on the stool beside his bunk and looked at the splint and adjusted the wrapping at the ankle where it had slipped. Pete watched her do it. "You came in after me," he said. "Not an accusation. Something quieter." "Yes," Clara said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. She tied off the wrapping. "People keep telling me I don't have to do things. I find I do them anyway." Pete was quiet for a moment. "This is because of you," he said finally. "The fire. Silas." Clara stopped. She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "It is." "I'm not saying that I'm not blaming." Pete struggled with it. "I'm saying I know what it cost you to say yes to this place, to this fight. And I want you to know that I don't mind." He paused. "That's all." Clara looked at the young man with his broken leg and his soot-darkened face and his earnest, searching expression, and she thought that 3 weeks ago she had arrived here not trusting any of them, waiting for the moment when the welcome would reveal its price. She had been wrong to wait. There was no price. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "Rest your leg." She went back to the desk and worked through the afternoon with the focus of someone who understands that the most effective response to chaos is to build order inside it. She updated the ranch accounts. She reconciled the week's supply deliveries. She wrote a precise damage assessment for the hay shed, calculating the replacement cost of the structure and the stored inventory and the labor time lost, because if the case went to damages, she wanted a number ready and she wanted it to be accurate. Cooper appeared at her elbow at 3 o'clock with coffee and said quietly, "You doing all right, Miss Whitfield?" "Yes, Cooper," she said. "Thank you for asking." He nodded, moved to leave, then stopped. "We're all glad you're here," he said. "The whole crew. I just thought you should know that." He left before she could respond, which was probably merciful because Clara was not entirely certain what her face was doing. She drank the coffee. She kept working. Sheriff Ames arrived the following morning with a deputy and a face that said his afternoon in Red Bluff had been productive in ways that were not yet finished. He examined the burned shed. He spoke to Pete. He read the statement Clara had prepared, made 3 notes in his record book, and looked at her across the kitchen table. "Gerald Dobbs was seen on the South Road 2 miles from this property yesterday morning," he said. "Before 7 a.m., a rancher named Sutton passed him going the other direction and remembered because Dobbs had no good reason to be that far north of town." Clara absorbed this without expression. "Is that enough?" "It's a start," Ames said. "Coupled with Silas Whitfield's presence on your property 3 days prior and the stated intention to recover documentation relevant to the fraud case. Yes, I've requested a territorial marshal because this has moved beyond a local matter." "When?" Clara said. "Already wired Prescott last night," Ames said. "Marshal should be here inside a week." She nodded. "What about Silas?" "Silas Whitfield is not to leave the county," Ames said. "He knows it. His solicitor Hatch came to see me this morning and was considerably less comfortable than the last time I spoke to him. Renner's company has retained separate legal counsel. He paused. When the land company separates itself from a client that fast, it usually means they've decided he's the problem. He is the problem, Clara said. Yes, ma'am, Ames said. I'm beginning to understand that clearly. After Ames left, Ethan found Clara in the yard standing in the morning air with her hands at her sides and her face turned slightly upward, not looking at anything in particular. He stood beside her for a moment. The marshal in a week, she said. Renner's lawyers cutting Silas loose. Ames with a witness placing Dobbs on the South Road. She breathed out. It's moving. It is, Ethan said. I thought it would feel more triumphant, she said. It just feels like more work. Most good things do, he said. She looked at him sideways. Is that your version of wisdom? James always said I stated the obvious and called it philosophy. She laughed genuinely the way she had been learning to laugh over these weeks without managing it first. He wasn't wrong, she said. Ethan smiled. A full, real smile, not the corner of the mouth thing she usually got. It changed his face substantially, opened it up, made him look younger, she thought, like the person he had been before a stampede on a winter night 2 years ago had closed something down inside him. She had been watching him open back up for weeks, slowly and without announcement, the way a window opens in a room that has been shut too long. She thought about what she had told him the night of the fire. Because I'm not alone in it. She thought about how easily the words had come and how much she had meant them and how different that was from the woman who had arrived here 26 days ago with $12 and a stolen ledger and no intention of trusting anyone. Ethan, she said. When this is over... She stopped. Started again because imprecision was not something she permitted herself. When the court case is resolved. When I have whatever my mother left me. When I'm not. She looked at her hands. When I'm standing on ground that's entirely my own. I want to do something with it. What kind of something? He asked. There are women in this territory, she said, who are in the situation I was in. No legal standing, no access to their own records, working without pay or watching their inheritances disappear into the hands of men who have legal authority over them. They don't have the skills I have. They don't know what to look for in a ledger. They don't know their own rights under territorial law. She paused. I want to open a desk, a real one. In town, in a proper space where women can come with their accounts and their documents and their questions, and I can help them understand what they have and what they're owed. Ethan was very still beside her. Not charity, Clara said firmly. Fair trade. They pay what they can, they learn what they need, and they leave knowing more than they came in with. She looked at him. My mother left me land even if Silas sold it. The court will determine what I'm owed in compensation. That's capital. I can use it to build something. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the unguarded thing again, and this time he didn't pull it back. You've been planning this, he said. I've been thinking about it since Prescott, she said. I couldn't stop thinking about what Crane said cases of this kind. He said it like it was routine. Women losing what's theirs to the men who are supposed to protect it. I've been living that routine for 6 years, and I know how it works from the inside, and I know what I would have needed at 16 that nobody gave me. She pressed her hands together. I can give it? Yes, Ethan said. You can. I'm telling you, she said carefully, because you should know what I'm planning given... She paused. Given where we are. Where are we? He said. Quiet, direct, giving her room. She looked at him. She considered being oblique, considered the measured, precise language she used for everything, the language designed to communicate without committing to share, without risking. She decided against it. We are, she said, 2 people who have been standing beside each other for a month and have both noticed that it's become the thing we rely on, and neither of us has said so directly. She held his gaze. I'm saying it now because I don't believe in letting numbers go unrecorded. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, 31 days, he said. She blinked. What? You've been here 31 days, he said. I know because I've been counting. Not for any reason I was prepared to explain, except that I noticed when you arrived, and I've been noticing every day since. He looked at his hands. I noticed the ledger. I noticed the way you held yourself in that street. I noticed the coffee going cold outside your door because you were already inside working before I got there. I noticed you mending my sleeve. He looked at her. I noticed when you laughed. The first real one. Day 14. You were talking to Pete about his bandage, and he said something ridiculous, and you laughed like you forgot you were allowed to. Clara felt something in her chest that was warm and precise, and a little frightening in the way that only good things are frightening. Day 14, she said. I'm a man who pays attention to things that matter, he said. Simply. The way he said everything. She looked at him for a long moment at the face she had been reading for 31 days. At the eyes that looked at her the way she had stopped believing anyone would ever look at her. At the man who had left coffee outside her door, and stood between her and a fist, and taken her to Prescott, and sat beside her while she cried over a letter from her dead mother, and run into a burning building, and never once asked her to be smaller, or quieter, or more manageable than she was. I'm going to be a lot of work, she said. Not a warning. An honest statement. I reckon honest accounts are exactly what I need, he said, and the echo of his own words from the first day made her breath catch, because he had remembered, and he had meant it then, and meant it more now. I'm not going to stop working, she said. The desk, the accounting, the women's cases, that doesn't change. I know, he said. I'm going to have opinions about ranch finances. You've been having them for a month, he said. We're saving $9 a month because of it. I'll probably drive you to distraction with the records. Clara. His voice was quiet and a little rough. I have been building toward asking you something since day 7, and you've been making sure I understood exactly who I'd be asking it of, and I have understood, and I am asking anyway. He turned to face her fully. Will you let me be part of what you're building? Not to run it, not to rescue it, just to be beside it, beside you. She looked at him. She thought about the woman she had been 31 days ago, the woman who had measured every offer against the cost she expected to find hidden inside it, who had bargained for her own wage on the day she was thrown out of her home, who had held herself together through 6 years of unpaid labor and public shame and one ordinary kindness from a stranger who had turned out to be something considerably more than ordinary. She thought about her mother, who had hidden $160 in a bank account in Prescott and written a letter to a notary, and hoped from the edge of her own death that it would reach the right hands. It had. Clara had found it. She had been the right hands. She was the right hands. Yes, she said. I'll let you be beside it. Ethan exhaled a long, slow release, like a man putting down something heavy he had been carrying at careful arm's length for 31 days. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the simple, deliberate act of a man reaching for the thing he means to hold. She let him. The territorial marshal arrived 6 days later, a spare, precise man named Holt, who read Clara's documentation with the concentrated attention of someone who understood immediately that she had done most of his work for him. He met with Ames. He reviewed the ledger copies. He examined the burned shed and spoke to the rancher Sutton, who had seen Dobbs on the South Road. On the 8th day, after the marshal's arrival, Gerald Dobbs was arrested on charges of arson and destruction of property. He held out for approximately 4 hours before his attorney arrived from Tucson, and took one look at the documentation and advised him that cooperation was the only remaining option with any sensible outcome. Dobbs cooperated. He gave them Silas. He gave them the full arrangement, Silas's original plan to sell the land to Renner's company. Dobbs' role as the intermediary, who had managed the deed transfer paperwork and collected the commission, the 4 years of water right income that had been split between Silas and Dobbs at 70-30, and the arson that Dobbs had set himself on Silas's direction with the explicit purpose of destroying evidence before the marshal arrived. He gave them Renner too, gave them the written correspondence between Renner's company and Silas, showing that Renner had known the title was contested and had proceeded anyway on the calculation that a 22-year-old woman with no money and no legal knowledge would never successfully challenge it. That calculation had been wrong. Silas Whitfield was arrested on a Tuesday morning in Red Bluff and charged with estate fraud, improper guardianship, conspiracy to commit arson, and 3 additional counts related to the undisclosed income from Clara's mother's estate. Gerald Hatch, the Tucson solicitor, withdrew his representation before the ink on the arrest warrant was dry. Clara heard about the arrest from Sheriff Ames, who rode out to Callaway Ranch personally and delivered the news across the kitchen table with the plain satisfaction of a man who has closed a case he was proud of. "The territorial court has already moved the deed review to the top of the docket," Ames said. "Given the criminal conviction, and it will be a conviction, Miss Whitfield, the evidence is that solid, the civil case for restitution should resolve in your favor within 2 to 3 months." "The bank account," Clara said. "Crane has filed the documentation," Ames said. "The account is yours. $162.40 with interest." He paused. "There's also the matter of compensation for the unlawfully transferred land, which, given Renner's separate liability, may ultimately result in a cash settlement rather than recovery of the parcel itself." "I know," Clara said. "I've run the numbers." She had been running them for 2 weeks. "A fair market compensation for the land, plus the 4 years of undisclosed water, right income minus legal costs, puts me in a position to fund the desk I'm planning." Ames looked at her for a moment. "What desk?" she told him. She explained it the way she had explained it to Ethan, concisely and completely, without embellishment or appeal, because the facts were sufficient. Ames listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield, I've been law enforcement in this territory for 16 years. The number of cases I've worked that came to me too late because the woman involved didn't know her own legal standing is—" He stopped. "It's considerable. A desk like what you're describing run by someone with your skills and your experience." He paused again. "It would matter." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm building it." The weeks that followed had a different quality from everything that had come before. The acute tension of Silas's threat resolved into the steady workable pressure of legal process. The court documents moved through their sequence. Crane wrote regularly, with updates each letter more optimistic than the last. Pete's leg healed cleanly enough that he was walking without a limp by the 6th week. The burned hayshed was rebuilt. Clara kept the construction accounts naturally, and the ranch went on with the particular resilience of a working place that understands disruption as a temporary condition. Clara kept the supply ledgers. She kept them immaculately. She also began keeping a second set of records that had nothing to do with Callaway Ranch. A growing file of the cases she was learning about secondhand from Walt's wife in town, and Dora's friends, and the women who came to the dry goods store and spoke quietly to other women about things they had no formal language for. A widow whose husband's brother had claimed the farm. A young wife whose father-in-law had altered her marriage settlement. A woman who had worked 20 years in her family's business and discovered when her father died that she had no legal standing in its inheritance. Clara wrote to each of them. She wrote practical letters, not sentimental ones. She wrote, "Here is what you have. Here is what it means. Here is what you can do with it." She included, where relevant, the name of Aldous Crane in Prescott, who had become over the course of these months something approaching an ally in the formal sense and a friend in the practical one. Ethan knew about the letters. He watched her write them at the desk in the evenings, and he brought her coffee, and did not ask her to stop or slow down or remember that she was also managing his ranch accounts, because he understood in the way she was learning to trust that he understood things without needing them. Explained that this was not separate from who she was. This was who she was. The desk and the accounts and the cases and the letters were all the same impulse, noticing what was wrong and refusing to look away from it. They were standing on the porch one October evening when Ethan said, "The cottonwoods are going yellow." "Summer finally broke," Clara said. "Took long enough." They stood in a comfortable quiet. The ranch was settling into the sounds of evening horses, the distant call of a bird, the ordinary domestic noise of Dora finishing in the kitchen. "I've been thinking about the property on the east side of town," Ethan said. "The one that's been empty since the Halverson family moved north. It's a good size. Ground floor could be a proper office space. The upstairs is 2 rooms that could serve as a residence if someone needed it. He paused. Belongs to a man in Tucson who's been trying to sell it for 2 years. Price is negotiable. Clara turned to look at him. It would need work, he said. New windows on the east side. The front door needs replacing. Probably the porch boards. He looked at the middle with the expression of a man who has been quietly calculating. Walt knows a good carpenter in town, and I reckon I know someone who's been saving up a considerable amount of $2 a week for 3.5 months plus what the court case is going to put in her hands. He glanced at her sideways. Just an observation. An observation, Clara said. I don't make decisions that aren't mine to make, he said, and the echo of her own words from 2 months ago made her chest fill with something that had no single clean name. It was gratitude and amusement, and the deep specific tenderness that comes from being known accurately by someone who chose to keep knowing you. I'd like to see it, she said. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. They went to see the property on Saturday. It was, as Ethan had said, a good size. It needed work. Clara walked through it with the systematic attention she brought to everything, noting the structural issues, the window light, the dimensions of the ground floor room that would become the office, the way the east wall caught the morning sun. She stood in the center of the empty ground floor and looked at what it was and what it could be, and she thought about her mother Ruth Whitfield, who had owned 12 acres and a house and a water right, and had hidden something aside for her daughter even while she was dying, who had tried to make sure Clara had ground to stand on. Clara was standing on it. She was standing on it now. She looked at Ethan in the doorway, watching her with the quiet attentiveness that had been the first thing she had trusted about him, and she thought about the desk she would put in the southeast corner where the morning light would fall on it, and the file cabinet beside it, and the sign on the front door, and the women who would come through it not knowing what they had, and leave knowing, and all the small, precise documented facts that would add up over time to something larger than any single story. I'll make an offer Monday, she said. Ethan smiled, the real one. Yes, ma'am, he said. 6 months later, on a morning in early spring, when the desert had briefly remembered how to be green, Clara Whitfield opened the front door of a properly repaired building on the east side of Red Bluff and set a sign in the window. The sign said, Whitfield Accounting and Legal Records. Consultations by appointment. Fair rates. Ethan stood in the street and looked at the sign. You didn't put my name on it, he said. It's my name, she said. It is, he agreed, and there was nothing in the way he said it, but simple, uncomplicated pride. She had worn her good dress, the dark one she had bought herself from Dora's friend in town. Not the torn frontier dress she had arrived in. Not the dress she had been wearing when she fell into the summer dust outside Whitfield and Sons trading post. A dress she had chosen herself, purchased with her own money on her own terms. The first appointment arrived at 9 o'clock, a woman named Margaret Sowell, 43 years old, whose husband had died in February, and whose brother-in-law had told her she had no claim to the family farm, because her name was not on the deed. Clara sat down across from her at the desk. Tell me what you have, she said. Start from the beginning. I'm going to take notes, Margaret Sowell told her. Clara took notes. Precise, comprehensive, careful notes in her even reliable hand, noting every date and every asset and every statement the brother-in-law had made, and exactly why each of those statements was or was not legally accurate. Margaret Sowell left an hour later with 3 pages of notes in her hand, and the name of Aldous Crane and Prescott, and the knowledge, the clear, documented, undeniable knowledge that she had considerably more legal standing than her brother-in-law had led her to believe. She left with her chin up. Clara watched her go, and then turned back to her desk and opened her record book to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. She thought about a girl in a summer street with blood on her face and dust in her hair, holding a ledger against her chest, because it was the only thing she had that was true. She thought about her mother's letter in a misfiled folder, waiting 20 years to be found by someone precise enough to look. She thought about Ethan Calloway riding into a street in Red Bluff and saying 4 words in a quiet voice and changing with those 4 words the entire direction of everything. She picked up her pen. Outside, she heard him cross the porch. His familiar step, the sound of him settling into the chair by the door that he had moved out there without comment last week because he intended to be nearby and he didn't need to explain why. And she heard him pour coffee from the small pot she had left on the porch rail. And she heard the particular silence of a man who was content where he was. A woman's worth is not decided by the people who used her, shamed her, or abandoned her. It is decided by what she builds the morning after she stops believing them. Clara Whitfield had decided, and she was just getting started.